At the end of last week, we put out a video which discussed how the coronavirus had been able to spread across the globe. We talked about the virus's spread and, probably most interestingly, showed you a bar chart which showed you the countries with the highest death tolls. I don't want to retread old ground, and for the full breakdown, the other videos are linked below, but if we zoom through the data, you can see that the first deaths were initially in China, with the country suffering the highest number of deaths for weeks. That was until the end of February, when China's death rate suddenly began to really slow. China did continue to report new deaths and continue to have the highest death toll, but on March 20th, Italy took the lead. Then, in subsequent days, Italy and Spain's death tolls really exploded, with China seemingly fading into the background. This is super interesting. How is the country where the virus originated able to grapple with the crisis and control its domestic spread enough that it's no longer the country with the most cases or the most deaths? The problem is that many people don't actually trust that China have done this, with some calling into question the authenticity of China's reporting. So in this video, we're going to discuss what China's done to limit the spread of the virus, what they've said about the virus, and if the global community can trust Chinese data. Before we get going, I just wanted to let you know that our series Opinionated is about to return. Last year we asked you what you thought about some big topics, and this year we want to know your thoughts on 4 more. We've got the survey online, and it's linked down below, so if you fill it out you can tell us what you think and have your views featured in the series. Also, every respondent gets a random instant win prize, from discount codes to TLDR gift vouchers to free badges. Fill out the survey and see what you can win down below. The coronavirus has been a disaster for China. Even if we put aside the tragic loss of life and the health impacts of the virus, COVID-19 isn't good news for China. For years, China has been attempting to position themselves as a credible global superpower, and looking at economic dealings, their productivity and their influence, it's reasonable to say they've done a pretty good job. The problem is that coronavirus could get in the way of their progress. Not only has it impacted their economy, limited their trade potential and hurt their people, it's also, to put it bluntly, been a PR nightmare. Senior figures in the UK have criticised China's response to the outbreak, blaming them for the animal rights abuses that started the crisis, the misinformation surrounding the pandemic, and the limitations that China's placed on medical equipment. And because of that, senior UK figures have now warned that this crisis could sour the UK-China relationship, saying that there would be a reckoning for the UK's relationship with the superpower. As this issue has developed, pressure has increased on Boris Johnson to begin severing ties with China, potentially even blocking the UK's deal with Huawei, although doing so would make fulfilling some of his pledges much harder. And it's not just the UK either. News agencies in Spain, the Netherlands and Turkey report anger within their respective governments about Chinese medical equipment. In the Netherlands, authorities have even been forced to recall some 600,000 faulty Chinese face masks, which were previously used by frontline health workers. So it's clear that countries and governments around the world are already unhappy with China. So if they begin to suspect that China's reports and statistics are inaccurate, relations are only going to get worse. And to be fair, it's easy to see why people might become suspicious, because China's response and control of the virus seems to have been nothing short of miraculous. Obviously, their over 3,000 person death toll is tragic, but compared to other countries, it's an incredible achievement. Italy currently has nearly 4 times the number of deaths, and their death toll continues to rise, with Italy still not at the peak of their pandemic spread. And the US has become the country with the largest number of infections, and their cases also continue to rise. So considering the virus started there and their huge population, China's just over 80,000 cases is miraculous. It's only 0.006% of their total population after all. Despite some people's doubts, China continues to insist that these figures are correct and that they're the result of the virus being effectively managed. China was certainly able to stamp down on the virus, limiting its spread through some pretty draconian measures that have gone further than any other country. They say that this stringent lockdown in Hubei province, the epicenter of the infection, helped limit the spread. On January 23rd, most major cities in Hubei were quarantined, stopping all transport between them. From the 1st of February, in most major cities, only one person from each household was permitted to go outside for provisions, and only once every 2 days. On the 13th of February, all non-essential companies were shut down, and a week later, on the 20th, all schools were shut down. In fact, local authorities also put in place so-called closed management policies, where the entrance and exits of local communities were manned by guards, who made sure that everyone coming and going had their temperature checked and was wearing appropriate safety gear. As of mid-February, 207 cities in the province had implemented some form of closed management. And if you were diagnosed with coronavirus, you could be forcibly quarantined in stadiums full of other sick people. And although there's little official information, there have been reports of imprisonment for those who break quarantine rules. So certainly China has cracked down on the virus and put in place measures that no other country could or would, something we discussed in our video on how South Korea and other countries have been able to flatten the curve. So it's not unreasonable to expect that China would have good results, considering how drastic their actions were. But even still, data coming out of China does seem almost too good to be true. So I think it's worth going through some of the reasons why people don't trust the figures coming out of China. But before we do, it's worth saying that it's not just people on Reddit who doubt China. Officials all over the world have shown skepticism. Boris Johnson's own scientific advisors are reported to have told the Prime Minister that China's figures could have been downplayed by a factor of 15 to 40 times, which would put China's total cases at somewhere between 1.2 and 3.3 million people, and their deaths at between 48,000 and 127,000. The White House also doesn't seem to trust Chinese figures, which isn't all that surprising, considering who's sitting behind the Resolute desk and his famously anti-China views. In fact, a senior administration official told CNBC that the White House does not have high confidence in the information coming out of China, and White House advisor Peter Navarro went even further, describing China as a disease incubator. On Wednesday, 3 US officials even outlined a report from the US intelligence community that concluded that China had misrepresented their total death toll. They weren't identified due to the confidentiality of the report, and they also didn't go into detail about the report's contents. But this distrust in China has existed since way before Trump. Even during the SARS outbreak of the early 2000s, the US had doubts. Back then, China was accused of covering up the severity of the outbreak, with Chinese officials only announcing the virus to the public several months after they were notified. This sounds remarkably similar to what happened this time round, and although China acted far faster in 2019, they were still slow to come public, making some think they're an untrustworthy source. In fact, Trump thinks that they're untrustworthy on a whole variety of topics, not just viral outbreaks. The Trump administration has regularly criticised Chinese economic data, and to be fair, they're not the only ones. In fact, even a former Chinese premier described their GDP figures as man-made, and Thomas Rorsky, professor of economics and history at the University of Pittsburgh, said that it was widely believed by economists and Chinese officials that the government's official data was simply not good. So, China was slow to react to the virus, something they've done before, and many people don't trust any data that comes from Beijing. On top of that, some became suspicious when Chinese officials refused the US's offer to send experts to Wuhan, and the government's also been accused of censoring coronavirus discussion online and detaining hundreds of Chinese citizens for spreading rumours. The problem with gauging if the Chinese data is accurate is we don't know enough about the virus generally. Countries around the world continue to report new information daily, and as such, confusion and inconsistencies abound. Even seemingly fairly simple things aren't clear, with current mortality rate estimates varying significantly. So with something as difficult to grasp as the coronavirus, it ultimately comes down to whether you believe China to be truthful. Do you think the country is honestly doing its best to accurately report the data, or is it treating this like a PR blunder and trying to cover up any issues and wrongdoing? The problem for China is they've proved themselves to be an untrustworthy source before, and it's not hard to think of why they might be motivated to do the same thing again. As we've said, China yearns to be the next big global superpower, and you could argue that the country's already achieved this status, so their image is very important to them. Like any brand in the middle of a crisis, those in charge are keen to protect the Chinese brand. The question is, how far they'd be willing to go. They've been seen downplaying and even covering up the crisis initially. But would they put lives at risk by manipulating data? It's certainly easy to see why they might be tempted to. Despite this, despite many global health leaders having doubts, and despite the country's issues in the past, the World Health Organization have not only trusted Chinese data, but have praised the country's recent efforts to control the virus. The executive director of the WHO's Emergencies Programme commented on the conflict between the US and China, saying this is a very obviously tense political environment because of the economic issues and because of everything else. Please let our scientists get on. Please let our public health professionals get on. Let them work together. So why is the WHO trusting China here? Well, there is a pretty decent case to be made for Chinese data. China has been regularly releasing data about the outbreak for weeks, at the same time every single day. They've also been keen to explain the data and have been very transparent about any adjustments made to their testing or methodology. Their data and trends of infection also line up pretty well with South Korea, so it is possible that their cases have genuinely decreased at a similar rate to South Korea's. And a lot of this action goes further than the countries that are criticising them, like the US. After all, Trump also denied the severity of the outbreak for weeks and continues to insist that positive attitudes and good feelings are as valid as genuine scientific rigour. The CDC also hasn't been diligent about reporting data, and a lot of their reporting has been significantly more confusing and less transparent than China. In fact, the CDC seemingly randomly removed testing statistics from their website at one point, and even today, clear information about testing in the US is unclear, with the country far behind other nations when it comes to their rate of testing. So some believe that the Trump administration's complaints about China are merely an attempt to pass the blame and distract from their own shortfalls. So while it's really easy to question China's transparency, and their track record isn't great, they aren't the only ones struggling with this crisis. As I said, at this time it's really hard to gauge how accurate China's stats are, and ultimately it comes down to how much you trust their government, and if you think that from their perspective, protecting the Chinese brand is more important than the risks associated with doing so. That being said, officials and experts all over the world are beginning to doubt Chinese data, so it's probably best not to take it at face value. Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Do you trust the data coming out of China? Do you think that your country is doing a better job? And of course, as always, you can get involved in this conversation over on Discord. There's a link to the server down below. If you want more updates on the coronavirus as it plays out, subscribe to the channel. And if you want to be notified every time we release a video, then hit the bell icon to begin getting notifications.